It is a well-known fact that horse-powered railway wagons preceded the locomotive, and for a time horsepower had the upper advantage. Unlike man-made steam engines, horses could tackle gradients. They were versatile and could easily be switched from job to job. They were strong, and at the time, the fastest way for humans to travel. Horses, however, did have drawbacks. They were animals with hearts and minds of their own, and sadly many cruel horse owners would beat their horses into submission, causing awful injuries and even death. The horses needed constant attention and care, and their care sometimes outweighed the costs, and while they could do a lot, the work that they did wasn't sufficient to keep up with the rising demand the Industrial Revolution was placing upon them. In their wake came the railway engine, and you would be forgiven that this would leave the use of the horse on the wayside. In some respects it did, but the railway and horses would remain closely connected right up until the 1960s and beyond. The process that eliminated the horse off the main line was very gradual. The public at first was terrified of these motorised steam-breathing giants that wheezed and clanked on the rails, so were more comfortable with tried and tested horsepower. The first horse-drawn train was first used between Stockton and Darlington, and it was relatively fast compared to the steam engines of the time. In its first year alone, over 30,000 people would travel either in luxury inside the stagecoach-like carriage or on the outside in the cheaper seats. The horse-drawn railway ran straight through the 1800s before each railway would succumb to the power of the locomotive, but the horse would not see the last of the railways just yet. The 1820s, the bulk of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad still ran on horsepower. The horses would power the wagons and worked well up and down the steeper gradients, but plans to extend the line between Baltimore and West Virginia would be too much of an ask and impractical for horsepower, so plans were drawn to steam haul the entire stretch. The railroad sought advice from the best railway engineers the world had to offer at the time, but the engineers were sceptical. Thanks to the railway boom, the UK was considered the best to go for this advice, and they were unsure that the locomotives that were around would be able to handle the steeper gradients and sharp curves along the line. Concerned, the investors turned to a self-educated inventor and businessman, Peter Cooper, for help. Peter wasn't well versed in railroading, but he knew machines and could give a unique perspective on the problem. He believed he could construct a locomotive that would be able to fit the need. He needed to, for more than just his ego. He had several thousand acres invested in land on which the proposed line was going to pass on. If the line was built and successful, the value of the land would skyrocket. Cooper fashioned a locomotive out of the most unusual parts. He used musket barrels for boiler tubes, an old brass engine that was laying around, and discarded wheels from a railroad workshop. His engine was a mishmash of parts and ideas, but amazingly, it ran. It was commonly known as a coffee pot engine with a vertical boiler and vertical mounted cylinders which powered the four wheels and was given the name Tom Thumb. It was the first ever steam-powered locomotive to run on a commercial line in the United States. It handled every curve and incline and reached an impressive 18 miles an hour. This engine was clearly, according to investors, just what they were looking for. There was a lot of speculation around this engine, and as the legend says in 1830, following Tom Thumb's successful run, horse traders could see the threat of the engine to their businesses. In a document produced in 1868, it is said that the Stockton and Tees Stagecoach Company saw the engine as direct competition and challenged it to a race between it and its fastest horse-drawn railroad car. The race would be set out drag race style, each competitor racing side by side. Cooper, not wanting to back down, accepted the challenge, and both locomotive and horse was coupled and yoked to a railroad car apiece. They both towed the starting line, and it is said that both engine and horse snorted and puffed in perfect time and in unison with each other as they both readied themselves for the pull. The public watched and the investors betted as the signal was given and both horse and machine set off with a roar. The horse pulled ahead quickly and had a half-mile lead while Tom Thumb built steadily up steam. Soon the engine was slowly catching up on the horse. As the horse began to tire, the locomotive surged ahead while the horse's owner dipped his head, knowing that the machine had won and the era of horsepower was nearing its end. Suddenly the engine began to wheeze and splutter. A leather belt had come off, causing the engine to slow and then stop. The horse began to make ground as Cooper desperately tried to fix the engine, burning his hands in the process. By the time the repair was done, the horse had passed him and it was gone. Although the horse won the race, its success was short-lived. The investors were so impressed with the engine and its ability to adapt to the difficult terrain that they pushed ahead with steam power. In just 6 short years, the age of horsepower railroads on the B&O line was no more, giving way to steam power. Although we can't prove that the race really existed, the demise of the horse to the railway is one told over and over again. While horse-powered coaches were a thing of the past, in the UK especially, wasn't the end for horses and the railways. Even in the days of steam, coal and water were an expensive commodity. Railway companies were only making money moving goods and passengers from place to place, and knew that wasting coal and water shunting was not the best idea. Smaller engines were brought in to help, but they still needed water, a crew, and several hours to get ready. The solution was simple: horsepower. Horses were ready whenever they got up. They didn't need crews to get them ready, only a groom or a stable hand, which were much cheaper than their steam engine counterparts. Seeing a horse shunt wagons or coaches were a common sight in goods and shunting yards. They added a further bonus of delivering the received goods into towns where engines couldn't go. They were the equivalent of a shunter and a lorry all rolled into one. By 1913, there was over 27,000 horses working the railway network up and down the UK. The public had a special connection with these gentle giants. For many in towns and cities, seeing the railway horse delivering its goods was a source of affection, and it was common for the horses to receive pets and treats from its grateful customers. But the horses were once again threatened in the 50s, when the arrival of the electric horse threatened to take away its delivery job. The 1950s Austin, being one of the new engines, needed no stabling or grooming and no extra care. The new diesels were coming up the ranks and were efficient as any horse shunting, and British Rail were keen to put horses out to pasture. British Rail, though, were not cruel and contacted the Blue Cross with a proposal. They offered and agreed to sell as many redundant horses as they had to the Blue Cross. The Blue Cross bought as many as they could and gave them homes where they would live out their retirement in peace. The public got involved too and started campaigns to save their railway horses from the knackers yard, with many communities buying them from the railway. Soon the sights of horses working up and down the line dwindled to just a single one. Charlie, a Clydesdale breed, worked the rails in Newmarket Station right up until 1967. He was tasked with moving horse boxes, made specially for the racehorses for the Newmarket races. As the very last horse to work the rails, Charlie became very well known and loved along the line, and many people would come out to see him. On the 21st of February 1967, Charlie shunted his very last horse box, his own, and was loaded into the trailer. He was taken to a farm for his retirement nearby, where he met his stablemate and workmate Butch, and they were both reunited until they passed away. Although the days of the railway horses are long gone, there are still glimmers of horses working the rails. In the Isle of Man, the 3-foot gauge horse-drawn Douglas tramway is alive and well and has been going for 140 years strong. The horses, known as trammers, work the rails as their ancestors once did. The horses are lovingly cared for and adored by the locals, and the public can go visit them when they're not working at their home on the island. It's amazing to think that horses still played a vital role on the railways, even today. And while we may not see the likes of Charlie working the shunting yards anymore, we still have the wonderful trammers to remind us of the times when horses were indeed the kings of the tracks. Horses have been a big passion of mine, and when I pass a field and a horse comes to the gate looking for a treat, I simply can't walk by without saying hello. I'm wondering what their ancestors maybe would have done.